I would like to start with General Ice and talk about this. As I mentioned, for those of you who were here at the beginning of this morning of the day, this morning, this topic is obviously very important to us. It's very important at JINSA. This is really kind of our area that we're increasingly working on. But since General Ice, before I say anything, I think before General Ice he was former, until a couple of years ago, was Israeli Defense Attaché, and before that was head of IDF operations. I think it'd be good to get his thoughts first. So, General Ice, thank you very much for doing this, and tell me what you see is important. I guess a little context first about where about the U.S.-Israel security relationship, at least when you were defense attaché, and how you see even changing, how it has changed, in the last couple of years since you left.
Okay,
Why don't we start that as like a point of departure, and then we'll get into that.
Thank you very much, Mike. First of all, I would like to thank you, the JINSA members and the staff that worked for the remarkable event yesterday. To my opinion, as someone who saw this event in the last 6 years, I think it was very special, and I think the footprint of JINSA here in Washington and in Jerusalem is well felt.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you for that.
You.
Going back to my time as a defense attaché, in fact, you know what? Let me start with a short story. A few weeks ago, I had a phone call, I had a conversation with Ambassador Dermer, and he told me during our conversation that he missed me, and he added that
We all do.
you should be here. You should see how things are done now. You should see how they accept us now in the White House and elsewhere. And I do envy him and the rest of the team, but I must add to it a few things. The nature of the relations between the two militaries, between the two defense establishments, is so deep, and it goes back years, many years. And I must say that in my 4 years here in Washington, to include the years that I was the head of operations at the General Staff in Israel, I felt that these relations are very much protected. Simple as that. And when I'm saying protected, I mean almost protected from the political level that sometimes have disputes. And it was a very unique period. Bear in mind the operation such as Protective Edge, Pillar of Defense, many operations that were not covered. Everything was inspired with the negotiations regarding the JCPOA and the interim agreement that came before. Having said that, the relations between the Pentagon and the defense establishment in Israel, and I was right there in the middle representing the Israeli defense minister and the chief of the general staff, were protected. The significant thing that have changed was the attitude towards ideas and new strategy that we as a defense establishment brought to the table afterwards, when the new administration came into office. And I must tell you that certain ideas that we brought to the table with the previous administration were postponed, were not accepted, and now they are willing to consider it. And I think some of it was mentioned this morning, some of it was mentioned by Ambassador Dermer. And I'm talking about many areas in the Syria region, Lebanon, Egypt, that was not mentioned today, and I think it's a key factor here.
We have a panel on this.
Excellent.
Yeah, so,
Jordan.
Yeah.
And almost in every area that I just mentioned, you would see a triangle where the U.S. defense establishment is the quarterback, and they are pitching to us or to one of our neighbor, and things are well coordinated at the military, at the intelligence level. And just to make sure that everyone is on the same page with us, there is many areas of cooperations. Just to give you the feeling, the group that is here in the Israeli embassy in Washington is not only the defense attaché. We have representatives almost from every areas: intelligence, R&D, training and doctrine, air, naval, logistics, signals, special intelligence, almost every area. And the reason why we have so many representatives here, not as it is, by the way, all over the world, is to reflect how deep are these relations. I'm sure that we are going to continue and to talk about it.
Actually, if I could just add, because this is something we are going to talk about before I turn to Jonathan, if you could just talk about this, because I mentioned it last night, and I think it'd be good because the 10-year MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Israel, basically U.S. military aid to Israel. It was negotiated in 2016, and you were in the middle of all that. Now it is now it just kicked in, I think, October 1st, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's a good. If you could just explain some about that, because then I'm going to ask a follow-up about. But I might turn to Jonathan first about it. But I'd like you to just lay that out, because I think it's those of us we work on it with a little more, But I think it's worth explaining a little more, because it was a very involved process. A lot of things we don't even know about.
It is an interesting process, and Amidror is here. I think he started it with his deputy in the year of 2013 and 14, and then they decided to stop the negotiation. I think he started with Phil Gordon. And when we started it, by the way, it was headed by Nagel, the ambassador, and myself. And the interesting fact that I would like to start with is that we didn't negotiate numbers. Not as people tend to think and believe. The way we started it, once it was authorized by the Prime Minister, and we waited for him to authorize it. We started to discuss the strategic challenge as we see it to the region in the next decade. And I must tell you, after a few presentations that we have had in the Pentagon, without going into too much details, and some presentations at the West Wing in the White House, the facts were accepted. Regarding the strategic assessment, the intelligence assessment, as we brought it to the table. The second phase was how we are going to deal with these challenges. So we brought our strategy to the table. And then the operational plans synchronized to that strategy and how we are going to address the challenge. And only at the third phase, at the third meeting, we brought to the table the capabilities needed for us to defend Israel in the next decade. So in fact, at that stage, you call it negotiation, what we discussed with our colleagues in the Pentagon and in the West Wing was the capabilities needed. And then I must admit, after it was accepted, we left the guys from the Israeli NSC and the US NSC to discuss the numbers derived from that. So at the end of the day, what came out from this MOU is a set of capabilities that we requested from the administration, and basically a certain amount of them was authorized and translated into numbers. And the reason why I'm explaining it is very important, because these capabilities are needed in certain capabilities are needed today.
Well, we're going to turn to that.
Certain capabilities are needed tomorrow. Right. And in certain cases, we cannot really wait 10 years to own those capabilities. You have heard Ambassador Dermer, it might be too late.
Yeah. So that's exactly, and if I may, and I'm not going to put you on the spot saying this, but my understanding is that it was very important for Israel to have this agreement signed with the Obama administration. There's a lot of criticism. Well, I would say a lot. There was criticism. We had Lindsey Graham, who spoke last night. We had him on a conference call after the MOU was on. And I think we got more press on that conference call than we did for almost any other thing, except for last night. We got We got it all over. But he was critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he was criticizing Susan Rice by name because it wasn't enough money. Now, setting that aside for a second, but I believe the Israelis thought it was very important. They didn't know who was going to win the next election. It was 2016. And you know, given the reputation of President Obama as not being maybe among many, you know, well, it was important that Obama, given who he was, that he signed off on this, so they were kind of blocking Democrats, no matter who was going to be president going forward. But you get a sense that given the White House then, it's another age, of course, that given how much they were in support of the Iran deal, I mean, that it's so important, that they just had a completely different understanding of what Israel's challenges were going to be for the next 10 years than you guys had.
Mm-hmm. So let me, you know.
Sorry for that long question.
I'll analyze it from the Israeli perspective. And I must say, not everything is yet known, not on everything we can speak. Behind that agreement, there are many other issues which are still classified, and I cannot mention them. What I can say is that the Prime Minister of Israel decided to sign this agreement and took some other decisions without elaborating on those decisions, although he was criticized, by the way, in the Israeli media heavily. And many people have offered wait and see what are the results of the election. He decided to move forward and to sign this agreement, to take some other decisions at the same time, although he didn't earn the political points for it. Right. And I think it's far more important when you are thinking about the bipartisan message came out of that agreement. Right. It's far more important. By the way, I'm fully aware, and I'm sure that General Amidor is fully into the details with Lindsey, with Senator Graham's suggestion, but it's not for me to get into it. Bear in mind that the Israeli government promised something, signed something, and they decided to respect it.
So I want to use that as a point. We're talking about the MOU because it's important, because obviously the defense aid is an important element. It's not the only element in the U.S.-Israel security relationship, obviously, but it's an important element. But it's something that JINSA has been looking at lately. And if Jonathan, and I want to come back to this MOU because we see that as kind of a foundational point, and you already kind of hinted to it. Jonathan, do you want to just say something about our report on the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship, who's involved, and just some of the recommendations?
Certainly. So the report that you all have in your packets today, we think cleverly named Atlas Supported, is based on a task force chaired by Admiral Jim Stavridis, who is a former head of NATO and U.S. European Command.
By the way, I'm sorry to jump. So he's also Greek American, so we were also looking for Greek-related titles. So we thought Atlas was a good one. I don't know, the best we could come up with.
We may have been too clever for our own
good.
good.
Maybe. I don't know if it meant as much to Stavridis as we thought it might, but we did it for. Okay, go ahead.
And so chaired by Admiral Jim Stavridis, the task force also included General Charles Wald, who was former deputy EUCOM commander, among many other postings, and also another former deputy EUCOM commander, Jack Gardner, who was Stavridis' deputy at EUCOM. So all three individuals had long experience with Israel, which is in U.S. European Command, and then also fourth member Trey Oberyn, who is the head of the Missile Defense Agency at the Pentagon. Obviously, missile defense is a cornerstone of U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and so as you can see in the report, there were no shortage of recommendations. Ranging from broadly strategic to very detailed. I think we had 23 overall. Rather than go through the laundry list of them, I'll build off with where the general started the conversation, which is security and defense cooperation between the United States and Israel is very close. Closer even than some of our formal allies. And so we started thinking, well, how do you reinvent the wheel? How do you come up with new and insightful ways to bolster U.S.-Israel security cooperation? And proceeding from the basic premise that the United States, its future leadership in the Middle East and around the globe more generally is perhaps uncertain, is fair to say. I think I can paraphrase our earlier panels in making that point. And therefore, if the United States its future commitments to the region are uncertain at the same time that you have a growing threat from Iran and its proxies across the region, chiefly Hezbollah, not to mention ISIS, both in the physical caliphate and through the rest of the region. That leaves countries like Israel as effectively guarantors and securers of U.S. interests in the region. When Israel defends itself by itself, it is in fact also ipso facto defending U.S. interests in the process. So we thought we'd take a look at what are the ways the United States can therefore bolster Israel's ability to do so. And we can go into the details of the MOU recommendation later, but one of the most fascinating things we came across was that Israel's technical status as an ally is on par with Afghanistan and Tunisia. And so that creates, it's not just a formality, it's not just sort of a window dressing issue. There's some key substantive issues there that are very important, and one of the most important that we found is the idea that Israel is currently operating over the skies of Syria. They're operating in the air defense bubble of advanced Russian air defenses, which, again, if you were here in the morning, you heard no shortage about their capabilities and the challenges they present. Israel is operating American-made airplanes, aircraft that have been modified by the Israeli Air Force, but nonetheless, the Israelis are gaining a lot of useful operational data and intelligence in the process, but because they don't have a higher status as an ally, they're unable to share that with us. So one of our recommendations is, with the stroke of a pen, the President of the United States can create a presumption of approval that Israel can share that information with us, and we can bolster the sharing of intelligence and weapons technology with them. And basically, our recommendation, therefore, is treat Israel like Australia. That's it's sort of become a hook line for the report, basically, that there's all these things that Israel is doing to help defend U.S. interests in the region, and there's some simple barriers like that have gotten almost no attention, but it should be relatively easy to knock down. Additionally, this may not be well known, the United States stockpiles multiple billions of dollars worth of weapons in Israel, primarily for the use by the United States in an emergency, but also available for withdrawal by the Israelis under special circumstances, which they have done in recent conflicts to restock some of their own weapons. And as we heard this morning from the panel on the law of armed conflict and the future Northern War, the operational requirements for the IDF in the looming potential conflict with Hezbollah and potentially other actors on its northern borders, and potentially also against Gaza simultaneously, it could create a contingency where Israel would need to draw upon those weapon stockpiles, and our recommendation is the United States should bolster those stockpiles with a lot of the weapons and other materials Israel would likely need in that conflict, chiefly precision-guided munitions, but also missile interceptors and various other things. So these are the sort of substantive recommendations that can be done relatively easy, that can clearly bolster Israel's ability to not only defend itself, but like I said, in the process, defend U.S. interests.
Yeah, if I might just add one thing. You know, one of the things this group, so we went to Israel in January and went again in the spring, and we met with a lot of senior Ministry of Defense and IDF folks then, and we've been in touch a lot since, and General Ice also. And you know, one of the things, just a basic thing, why Jonathan mentioned precision-guided missiles. Why is that important? Because Israel's intelligence right now is actually excellent. The problem, they feel they have excellent intelligence. They know where a lot of their targets are, let's say in Lebanon, but what they lack is the precision-guided missiles to hit all those targets. So they have the targets better than ever before, but they don't have the missiles to actually, sufficient enough missiles to hit those targets. And by the way, just to remind, in the 2014 Gaza war, Israel had a special request for Hellfire missiles, which we won't ask ICE to address, but and the Obama administration has delayed that in responding. So I think, for Israel's sake, they'd rather have those weapons in Israel. At least, you know, they'd have to ask American authorization, but they'd rather have as much pre-position as possible for use in emergency. So we've also briefed Secretary Mattis on this before we put out the report. We briefed Undersecretary John Rood. We briefed senior, we briefed Bolton's deputy. We briefed other folks. Actually, Senator Cotton mentioned how we just met with him last week about this. Ed Royce, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and others. We've also tried to work with some of our, this is maybe an un-Jewish thing to do, but we've tried to work with other pro-Israel organizations that are focused on this thing, says AIPAC, where we've, I think, done a lot of work on this, and there's more that's going to be coming out very soon. I mean, derivatives of this report or elaborations of this is because I think, again, the strategic context is we have a moment here is just to emphasize what we've said before. I think you have an administration that's very supportive of Israel, very anti-Iran, but is reluctant on the ground, and you got to therefore give Israel, I think, the tools. And it is, and we don't know who's going to be president in a couple of years, and the Iranians might want to try to wait out the Iranians, but Trump, but we should really use this opportunity to really push as hard as possible, I think, to bolster the Israel security. So let me go back to the MOU that you were saying, General Alex. One of the things that we learned in our trip, in our research, is that, so this is a 10-year aid package, and that's great, but the question is, what is it, I think since what's become obvious in the last couple of years, and even in the last 6 months or 12 months, is that this Iranian-Israeli conflict is well, General Amidror was saying it might not be inevitable, but the probability of it is certainly high. And you got 130,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon, and what Iran is trying to do in Syria to boot. So is it good for Israel? Is it help Israel a lot to have some F-35s and some of these KC-46s, air refueling tankers, 8 years from now? Or would it be better for them to have it in the next year or the next couple of years? And I'd like you to, so we've recommended and we've encouraged some of our other pro-Israel organizations in town on this, and is to, we call front load the MOU. We aren't asking for more than $38 billion over 10 years, but as opposed to $3.8 billion every year in very clear amounts, could some of that money, let's say from year 8 or year 9, basically be front-loaded and be used earlier, be spent and utilized. And by the way, this is good for U.S. jobs because these weapons are mostly made here in the United States. So I think, General Ice, could you address that point? So that's something that we're pushing, and I'd like General Ice to.
Okay, so what you just described, Mike, this was a description in terms of budget. Let me try and describe it in terms of operational capabilities. It means instead of acquiring those new advanced capabilities in the next 10 years, we will be able to acquire those operational capabilities and translate them into stockpiles or squadrons or whatever. I don't want to go into the details in the next 5 years. And once you are acquiring those operational capabilities in the next 5 years, you are creating a different deterrence. By creating a different deterrence, you are changing the equation in the region. Let me just use something that Gadi Eisenkot, the chief of the general staff, shared with the Israeli public, so I can say it here. Only in the last 2 years, we were using thousands of precise guided missiles in what we called campaign between wars. Now, in purpose, I'm not saying only Syria, okay? The campaign between wars, that its strategic goal is to postpone the next war, consumed already some of those stockpiles. So it's really relevant to own those operational capabilities, unique operational capabilities, with ground, with sophisticated munitions, sophisticated aircrafts, the KC-46 and many other capabilities. What you were saying in terms of budget will allow us in the next 5 years to own those significant operational capabilities and to project something else to the region. When I'm saying to the region, I mean not only to the adversaries, but also to our friends in the region. So I think it's highly significant, and it will be a strong, powerful message also by this administration Bear in mind that the MOU was signed with the previous administration.
If I could just to piggyback on what the general said, look at what the next 10 years looks like in the Middle East. In terms of a potential conflict with Hezbollah, the former chief of the Israeli Air Force has said, I believe just last year, in the next war, they plan to hit as many Hezbollah targets in Lebanon in the first 48 hours as they did in 34 days in 2006. Wow. That's incredibly high operational demand, and that's it's obviously no one knows if and when that war will come, but there's also a pretty set calendar that.
Could I interrupt that?
Yeah.
So just to get a sense of that, what does that mean for targeting ratio, let's say, per day? So how many?
So there are two elements here. One of them is the operational tempo that was just mentioned. But if you are thinking about the enemy's capabilities to launch, and we are going to own the missile defense capabilities, but these capabilities are not the only answer. So you have to add to the defensive factor a very significant, comprehensive, offensive factor. And this factor was mentioned by Jonathan and by the chief of the Israeli Air Force. And it's like throwing a blanket on fire. The whole idea is to prevent them from launching. We tend to mention here the number of rockets and missiles, but the whole idea is to prevent them from launching. If they will launch it, they'll be able to affect not only the strategic sites in Israel and the civilian population in Israel, but also the operational capabilities. So time is of an essence. And that's why the operational capabilities mentioned here in terms of budget and in terms of operation are so significant.
Sorry, Jonathan, but I think that was
just very quickly, something you can set your watch to is the relinquishment of even the softer constraints that were contained in the Iran nuclear deal. In 2 years, the conventional weapons embargo on Iran is lifted, and believe it or not, right now, Iran's defense sector is almost hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. They can't cooperate on R&D, they can't do imports and exports of advanced conventional weapons. In 2 years, that goes away. 3 years after that, the same equivalent ban on ballistic missiles goes away. And this is all years before the actual restrictions on Iran's nuclear weapons program begin lapsing. And so if you take the MOU to its current end date of fiscal year 28, that puts you about 2 years short of when Iran is fully free to pursue a nuclear weapon outside the bounds of the JCPOA. But I think one thing that was not mentioned in Ambassador Dermer's speech, but there are these other milestones that are much closer along the way that could very significantly affect the strategic balance in the region.
Okay. Okay. How much time do we have here? 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. All right, we go on this. We thought it was important to talk about some of these more technical issues about the security relationship. Obviously, we could talk a lot more, but I think why don't we take questions and then we could fit that in. Yeah, hey, go ahead.
Stuart Sloan. Mike, a couple of years ago, you made a big push for the United States giving to or selling to Israel surplus B-52s as a credible threat to Iran. Whatever happened to that idea? Did it get any traction?
Okay, so I'm glad you brought it. It was actually 4 years ago. In fact, it was April. General and I involved with us, and we wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was April 2014, when Aish was defense attaché. So we raised that issue, and we framed it as a way to add leverage for the negotiations. Of course, we all know with Iran. Because we all know that the Obama administration had a different conception and thought deleveraging was actually a better way to go about having negotiations with the Iranians. But maybe I could address it. I would say that that issue did come up. I found in the 2015 debate, I know Dennis Ross, who used to co-chair Iran effort, really ran with that for a while. My understanding, and Aish would know more than me, and I learned a lesson from this, which I'll explain, is that it didn't get picked up because the Israelis didn't ask for it. And now I could speculate why they didn't. Maybe Aish doesn't want to say, so I'll say why I think. One is I think Obama would have said no. It did come up whether I remember Dennis Ross writing and saying that, you know, that Obama did offer that if like Netanyahu would not oppose the Iran deal, this might be a goodie to that a sweetener that the U.S. would do. But I'm not sure that's true or not. But I know Dennis has said that the issue did come up. I also suspect, and I'm not going to ask ICE to address it, but I also suspect that if the Israelis actually asked for it, then it would suggest that they didn't have the capability to hit Iranian nuclear facilities like they claim they did, and they've always said that you do, but you have different capabilities. But one thing we learned from it that's relevant also in this is that if you're going to propose a policy, something like that, you want to make sure that the other party actually is going to follow up and ask. And I think the Israeli government did not. So I think it became part of the debate. I know that a lot of AIPAC folks were very interested in it. And we had senators that came to us. We briefed even Senator Cotton, who spoke last night about it. His office approached us. Senator Cruz, Coates, who's now head of intelligence, DNI. We had senators that we talked to about it, and they were very interested. But they said, we need the Israelis to ask us for it, and then we'll go from there. But the Israelis didn't. Do you want to?
I would
But we've done that differently with this report, by the way.
Definitely.
This time, with ICE help, now we have recommendations even before we released the report. We also briefed senior IDF folks. We briefed the Israelis about some of this, just like we briefed Secretary Mattis before we put it out, and we got some of his thoughts. Actually, I won't say which, but some of his recommendations, things that he told us he thought were helpful, we actually incorporated the report. So we try to brief both sides more on that before we put something out to make sure we were aligned. But ICE, do you want to address this?
Just to make sure that everyone is
Maybe
familiar with the
Elliot back
case
there might have something
of
to
the
say about it.
B-52. As far as I know, B-52s were not given or sold to any country around the globe, including very close allies of the U.S. So this is one element. The second element is, at the end of the day, it's not only a question of being able to close the distance, which is a strategic bomber capability. It's also what it carries. So you.
The whole idea, I thought, was you needed the capability to carry the 30,000 pound bunker buster.
That's
That
right.
allegedly, according to publications around the globe, only the U.S. own it. So it has to be given as well.
Same time.
Okay. And some other capabilities that will help you to guide it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's far more complicated, and the most important lesson here is before you are, offering or suggesting something, discuss it with both sides.
By the way, I will say we did inject into the debate, and I found it helpful to inject into the debate. I'm not just saying that, and I was conscious of it at the time. We wanted to raise the bar about what the United States should do for Israel, and we thought that was a good thing to raise. And frankly, I think it would have been an interesting thing if it was really more serious discussed, because I think it would have been a strong signal to the Iranians that, we are not going to let you have a nuclear weapon, and if we don't take care of this issue, we're going to let we're going to give the Israelis the tools. But they didn't do that. But what we're talking about now with this report is we didn't bring up the B-52s or the GBU 57s, the MOPs, the massive ordnance penetrators, the 30,000-pound bunker busters, but we're talking about other weapon systems that certainly, that's a little more. Yeah. So, but it's a good question.
Can you elaborate on what you're asking?
Yeah. Jonathan, you want to be more specific about the weapon systems that we're talking about?
Certainly. So in recommending front-loading the MOU, we talked about certain weapon systems that Israel could procure more readily with these advanced funds. In addition to the F-35 and as interim measures, F-15s or F-16s, additional squadrons of those. In addition to mobility and transport aircraft, also precision guided munitions, specifically GBU 39s and 53s, which are
capabilities.
Precision capabilities, yes. Precision guided munitions, much smaller than a bunker buster, talking 2,000 or 5,000 pounds, I think, instead of 30. But things that the Israeli Air Force already uses. Also, additional Hellfire missiles, as Mike mentioned earlier, that had been an issue in the past. And then also things, joint direct attack munition kits, which Speaking as a layman, are basically precision kits you can retrofit onto essentially dumb bombs to make them precise.
By the way, I hate to put one of our speakers on the spot, but maybe in the next panel, when Elliot Abrams is up here, I remember a piece that Elliot wrote in the Weekly Standard online when the MOU was signed, and also the side letter. So maybe if you don't mind, I'm sorry to do this to you, you might address the thing that we've been recommending also about front-loading the MOU, so Israel gets some of this aid now so they could acquire some of these things. I think, anyway, I'd be curious if you might want to address that. I'm sure you've thought about it yourself. So. And by the way, everyone should read, while I have the floor on Elliot, everyone should read Elliot's piece in the Washington Post today on the Saudi issue. I thought it was very interesting. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Charlie Perkins. I do defense issues at APAC. And a couple of quick points before I ask the general a question, more of a broad philosophical question. First is just really from the professional level, and I've been working U.S.-Israel strategic defense ties for decades now. The document that Mike and Jonathan and his team have put together with the Admiral and the generals, is really exceptional. There's much that happens below the horizon, and appropriately so. But in terms of documenting both what happens now and tracing a path forward, and now all of our jobs is to do our individual jobs to make that actually happen. But the constellation of options and the conceptual work that went into it is really exceptional. And then again, having heard the General Aish's bio, doesn't do justice to the work of a gentleman who really at a very critical time was, as we say, where the rubber hits the road in terms of making things happen in the relationship, working day in and day out with a whole constellation of individual, sometimes competing parties within the U.S. defense and military establishments. Stepping back to look at the forest maybe instead of some of the trees in the report, there is the concept that Israel will defend itself by itself, and that is fundamental. In my exchanges, since the report came out, but also for years, I get pushback on the issue of how can America grow its defense relations with Israel, and especially support it in times of crisis, with military means, air defense, resupply, and other things. Does that negate the concept of Israel defending itself by itself? And I say no, because we're not talking about a footprint of battalions and divisions of American troops. It's about using the synergy of how we work together, the scalability of what America has and can bring to the region in complement to the tenacity and the will and the technology of the IDF. So just from an Israeli voice, I think it's important, if you could, General, how do you see this concept of defending the nation by itself together with building the defense relationship with the U.S.?
Okay. So I think when you are saying, Charlie, defending ourselves by ourselves, it's very simple. We are not asking for we have not asked, we are not asking any U.S. presence or someone else to do the job for us, here or there, it doesn't matter. What we were talking about is based on reciprocity. When we are talking about unique relations, let's take as an example intelligence, it's a two-sided pipelines working on a daily basis, helping to save Israeli and American lives on a daily basis. When we are talking about R&D and we are talking about tunnels or underground capabilities, these are Israelis and Americans doing what they are doing to save American and Israeli life on a daily basis. When we are talking about missile defense capabilities, these are Israeli and American companies building the Arrow 3, Arrow 2, David Sling, and Iron Dome, and producing it here and in Israel to save Israeli and American lives. And when we are talking about the ability to protect a platform, a tank or an APC with an armor protection, a system such as a Trophy, which we are sharing with our colleagues in the U.S. Army, it's there, and the U.S. Army is equipping its APCs and tanks now with a few hundreds of those. It's to protect U.S. and Israeli life. So we are bringing to the table certain capabilities, our colleagues bringing significant capabilities, and we are there to share. When I was called by Chairman Dempsey at the last week of Operation Protective Edge to accept an immediate delegation to Israel while we are fighting in Gaza, and to host them in order to be able to study immediately the immediate lessons from the operation in Gaza, there was no doubt that General Gantz is going to authorize it. And they were accepted in the middle of the operation. By the way, my colleagues have nothing good to me to say good to me about that delegation. What are you doing? We are in the middle of a fight. But they were accepted. So at the end of the day, we are trying to create something else here together. But when it comes to operations and to defend ourselves, we are not asking anyone else to do it but us. When it comes to the relevant capabilities that were mentioned here, there is no doubt that by having these unique relations, it elevates Israel capabilities to a different level.
And I'll just conclude. First of all, I appreciate what Charlie you said, because not often does one organization complement the work of another organization, certainly in the pro-Israel community. So I think that might have been the most newsworthy thing, at least I heard today. So I appreciate that very much. I hope everyone appreciates it. I'm only sorry that Phil Derevov was on the National Board of APEC and stepped out before that had happened. But okay, fine. Thank you. All right, but we have to conclude because we're running late. And we have our final panel coming up on Egypt. Yes. Okay, thanks. All right, thank you very much.